Horror fiction has never been more popular. Between the years 2022 and 2023, sales of horror and ghost stories rose by a whopping 54%. And since then, this trend has continued, which begs the question, why this explosion of interest in this particular genre? And what is the history of horror fiction anyway? Time to open the books here on Things Visible and Invisible. Eleanor Bourg Nicholson works as an editor, educator, as well as a homeschooling mother of 6. However, she has another calling, and that only comes out at night. She is a horror author. She has written a number of horror novels involving werewolves, vampires, and exorcisms, and she joins me down the line from her home in Virginia. Eleanor, welcome to Things Visible and Invisible.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, what got you into fiction, Eleanor?
Well, I've always had an interest in fiction, very inclined towards literature from an early age. My mother was an omnivorous reader, and I found that reading led me to writing when I could first pick up a pencil. So I've always been writing stories, not in a Gothic mode until much later, but since childhood, I've always had an interest in writing.
Well, a lot of people have interest in writing and do express themselves in creative writing of one sort or another. However, you've gone for a particular genre. When did you discover that you were a horror author?
Well, my interest in that genre came in my late teens when I finally convinced myself. I'd read Frankenstein, I'd read Stevenson, I'd read a number of Gothic works, but I couldn't bring myself to read Dracula. When I finally did, I thought it was the most brilliant train wreck of a novel and became very fascinated with it. I worked on it through my undergraduate and graduate time at university, and then started playing with ideas formulated from studying of Dracula and the entire genre.
Well, let's look at that, Eleanor, because one of the reasons I was very keen to speak to you was to look at the history of the horror fiction genre. A lot of people just assume that there's Frankenstein, Dracula, and maybe Stephen King, but there's a lot more to horror fiction than that. Where shall we start?
Well, I think we could go back to man's interest in things unseen can go back to the ancients. If you think about monsters and dreadful myths, which are such a fascinating expression of man's desire to understand reality. I think about my children. We were building a puzzle the other day covered with myths, and we were identifying all the different myths and saying, well, here's a monster that was believed to eat sailors in South America, passing around the bottom of South America, and trying to see how stories would come out of the desire to explain things that are strange, things that are frightening, things that go bump in the night. So I think that instinct for Gothic expression is in the soul of man and has been for millennia.
Very, very interesting. Obviously, the ancients had their legends and their myths, as you say. There's a lot of monsters and Gothic elements to it, but the real sort of Gothic revival, if you like, in horror fiction started many, many centuries later. It started in this country, in England. Tell us a little bit about that, and why do you think suddenly this entity reared its ugly head?
Well, Gothic proper, as you've hinted, was a reaction. It was a reaction to the high Enlightenment. So you have these hyper-rational ideas that are sweeping through the civilized world. And many things were dismissed. The preternatural was dismissed. The supernatural was sort of contained and made digestible to the rationalist palate. What happens to everything that's irregular, strange, and horrible? So as a reaction against it, writers like Walpole and his Castle of Otranto, but definitely the High Romantics, said they wanted everything that had been cut out by the Enlightenment. There's a line in The Marriage of Heaven and Hell that says it describes a demon who's inscribing on the sky, and it's what he inscribes is something along the lines of, how do you know but every bird that cuts the airy way is a world of experience closed to your senses five? So saying the senses can only get you so far. What's beyond it? And of course, you have this emergence in not just in poetry, but in fictional form of where the monsters lie, and how man can negotiate encounters with the monsters.
Do you think, Eleanor, there's a particular reason why England became the epicenter for this Gothic revival?
Well, possibly. I'm going to quote Van Helsing at you from Bram Stoker's Dracula. So it's an Irishman. Well, it's a fake Dutchman written by an Irishman speaking of the English, and he describes London as the place of most promise for Dracula himself, because as he describes it, and that's much more coherent than Van Helsing is in the book. He's a very strange, thick accent, which I think was delivered on Stoker's part. He's saying that man is so rational here in England, and we've embraced rationalism so strongly that we don't believe in this nonsense anymore. So it's the perfect breeding ground for monsters, if that makes a sense.
Absolutely. So around about the end of the 1700s, these Gothic novels started to appear. They were very popular in their day. However, very quickly they were being lampooned. I think Jane Austen, for example, wrote a very famous novel where she was lampooning the kind of craze that was around at this time. Tell us a little bit just how popular this genre was at the turn of that century.
It was huge. It was huge, and everyone loved to read it. And yes, in Northanger Abbey, Jane Austen, it's her brilliant send-up and celebration, actually, of the genre. One of the most lovable characters in that novel, Henry Tilney, he is a lover of Gothic novels. The difficulty for the heroine is that she reads them and takes them a little bit too seriously. So Henry Tilney is, as Jane Austen would present him to be, is saying, this is great, but also remember reality. And there was concern at the time, especially that young females would read these sorts of books, and it would corrupt their morals and their intelligence if they could not see beyond the fantasy. And some of the works were relatively respectable, but the monk, which by Lewis, was so scandalous that it almost destroyed the questionable respectability of the genre. Interesting side note, in Northanger Abbey, one of the least likable characters confesses to have read The Monk and enjoyed it. And so that's sort of code for Gothic novel aficionados, that Jane Austen is saying, don't like this character, don't trust him because he liked The Monk.
It's funny how that continues to run parallel with the horror genre, this sort of slightly salacious side to it. But it also means that as a genre, perhaps it's not taken as seriously as some other genres.
Oh, I would say that is the case. And there's a spectrum here. The penny dreadfuls that were very popular during the 19th century, they were truly dreadful. They were very badly written. They didn't have a lot of depth. But if you look even outside England, if we look to France for a moment, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, which is a Gothic novel, is an incredible, rich, beautiful novel. Frankenstein is a weighty, weighty work, although its respectability was a little questionable as well because of association with the Romantics. So you'd have things of great literary work, and you'd also have smut in the same genre.
So it was ever thus.
Yes. Yes. But I do think one of the things that makes the genre so fascinating to me personally, and I think it led to its endurance in that era of deep and good readers, is that it's a genre where you can dabble in deep questions. If you have a drawing room comedy and you talk about life and death and salvation and damnation, it's going to be pretty preachy and obnoxious. But in a Gothic novel, you must address these sorts of weighty, deep human questions.
But also, I mean, I think, Eleanor, you can discuss weighty issues in a very entertaining way, which brings us to the next novel, which is like this sort of mountain in the horror genre, which of course is Frankenstein. You've alluded to it already. It was something which was sort of at the same time as Northanger Abbey was being written or read, but this was a very different book with a much deeper and a much darker content. Tell us a little bit about its creation.
Mary Shelley her background is very interesting. She's the daughter of two very progressive revolutionary thinkers, Godwin and Mary Wollstonecraft. After Mary Wollstonecraft died, her husband published an expose of her life, which destroyed his young daughter's credibility. Was not accepted in polite society because of the wild and socially unacceptable behavior and stands of her mother. Well, she became entangled with Percy Shelley, the poet, and ran off with him, at which point her very progressive father slammed the door and refused to have anything to do with her. So she was dragged all over Europe with Percy Shelley, who was simultaneously having an affair with her sister, her half-sister. And she had a couple of miscarriages, young Mary did. Anyway, so she's had all of that experience. And finally, when Percy's first wife killed herself, he married Mary, and she and her sister went to stay with Percy Shelley and Lord Byron and Polidori, his physician, at Lake Geneva. And they were sort of bored, talking all of the different topics that fascinated them. Well, one night Shelley has probably a drug-induced nightmare, and they start discussing it. It was something about a disembodied woman's head, I think, and said, well, we'll pass the time. Who can write the scariest ghost story? And Mary Shelley started writing Frankenstein, and Polidori wrote a very short, pretty dreadful work called The Vampire, largely based on the personality of his employer. But that's where it originated, in this game between this poetic circle, this highly intellectual, highly intelligent circle, a little bit on the fringes of society, but also drawing on it all of Mary's personal struggles and experiences. So that book is just loaded with some of the topics that the Romantic poets with which they grappled, but it's also about man and his existence and his relationship with his creator, and what does it mean to be created and not loved. It's a fascinating novel, very rich. I think people are usually, having seen movies, when they read the book, they're a little struck by the fact that the creature stops halfway through the book to learn how to read, and one of the things he reads is Paradise Lost. So he stops and reads Milton, and then we go on with the story. It's just a fascinatingly rich work.
Yes, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's a very deep allegory about personal responsibility and the consequence of our actions, but it's also a very philosophical text. So a lot of the film adaptations in particular are so far removed from that to say that they have the name but little else. However, there's something I just wanted to ask your opinion on, Eleanor, and that is the authorship, because this has proved to be a rather controversial issue. Mary Shelley, you've alluded to her writing this. She was very, very young at the time. I mean, I think she was 18. People have said this is not possible. This is not possible that an 18-year-old woman at that time, given her background, could have written something so deep. Other names have been posited as potential authors. Where do you stand on that?
I'm inclined towards the Mary Shelley tradition, partly because of her upbringing. And if you read, we mentioned Jane Austen earlier, if you read the sorts of things that Jane Austen was producing at the same age, they were superior, in fact, in form and composition. But I do also think that Mary Shelley, with her upbringing, was exposed to many ideas, and it was very well read, but especially the exposure to those ideas that would have led her into the society of somebody like Percy Shelley, who was a pretty dastardly human being, but clearly had streaks of genius. So I think that it would certainly not have been beyond her, and a lot of the confusion that's in the book, which very much lends itself to a Gothic Gothic novel, is to have philosophical and moral confusion and distress that you can feel in the text itself. That is very attributable to a, a very irregularly brought up young woman.
Would you say, Eleanor, that Frankenstein is a kind of a template for most horror novels since?
I think it has its fingerprints on all the horror that follows. In the same way that if you look at a sister genre, which is the mystery novel genre, you can't read mystery fiction and avoid references to Sherlock Holmes.
Yes, yes. Or even references to Edgar Allan Poe, which leads us nicely to our next port of call in this whistle-stop tour of horror fiction. Edgar Allan Poe, would you suggest that he's the next major name when it comes to this genre?
Yes, and I can see it very much, and has a lasting influence as well, and is from where I live. He went to the University of Virginia, which is just down the road from us. Um, no, he had a huge influence, and I'd also say that he brings, I just mentioned the mystery genre, he brings another important element for the Victorians to the forefront, which was we see the emergence of three genres that are all interrelated. They bifurcate. I mean, it's all over the place by this point in our modern day, but you have the mystery novel emerging, you have the Gothic novel in full steam ahead. But the third was the sensation novel, which is a little bit different, but they're tangling or addressing many of the same themes just in different ways. And Edgar Allan Poe, who is considered one of the fathers of the mystery genre and a writer of Gothic genre, was also deeply involved in the sensation genre. So it's this weird relationship that you get in the genres and in the works of many of these authors.
Now, what's really interesting is that we've now moved from Europe, from England, from Europe, across the Atlantic to North America. What do you think the North American experience brought? What sensibility did it bring to the horror genre at that time?
Well, it's difficult to say with Poe because with someone like Hawthorne, they seem more influenced by the English tradition than they do by the American tradition, which is a little bit more metaphysically um, skeletal. So if especially since you have a largely puritanical influence in the American tradition, Poe feels like a rebellion against that. And to that extent, he's looking more towards England and especially to Paris for Poe. Um, so I think I don't know that that it was genre changing, but genre enriching, just because of the personality of someone like Edgar Allan Poe and his weird mixture of hyper-rationalism and extreme emotion and extreme terror all woven together.
I'm slightly dreading asking this question, Eleanor, but you hit the nail on the head. Whether it's Mary Shelley, Edgar Allan Poe, or Bram Stoker, or H.P. Lovecraft, there seems to be a kind of running theme amongst horror writers that they kind of start to embody that which they write. As a horror author, are you very aware of this? And if so, how do you protect yourself?
Well, what I would say is that I think that's the dynamic that's to be seen in the best horror works, which is that the reason that you can plumb the depth of things monstrous is because, frankly, we live with ourselves and we are pretty monstrous. We're pretty monstrous human beings, capable of horrible things. And I think I like to call it with my students, the funhouse mirror. The moment when you're reading a Gothic text and you are, horrified by or disgusted by the behavior of a monster, and then you realize that you have that capacity within yourself to be as monstrous. That's the whole dynamic in Frankenstein. That is the question of the creator and his creature. Well, who's the monster? And so that there can be a moment of personal reflection there as well. I do hope, however, on a personal note, to follow Jane Austen's example and to partly through deploying humor, which for me is an awkward coping mechanism in moments of extreme terror, I can preserve myself a little bit from the monstrous taint and hopefully won't go quite as mad as some of my fellow novelists. Yes, it's a wonderful, wonderful work. And I think people, because it's become so enculturated, one thing people miss out on with that particular book, and this is common among Gothic novels as well, is the irregularity of the text. And that is, you don't just get the story head on. It's a gradual revelation of horror. So everyone says, oh, Dr. Jekyll becomes Mr. Hyde. Well, no, that's not how the book works. That's not how, or the novella works. There's another text, much less well known, called Confessions of a Justified Sinner by Hogg. And that too is this irregular interchange of manuscripts and accounts and testimonies and who's telling the story and where did the story come from, which you find that very much in Gothic novels, is that I came across this text, or Frankenstein, I found this man and he told me this story. And I think one of the reasons is because it's such an irregular thing. To suspend disbelief, you have to start out by acknowledging how irregular it is. For example, it would be a strange thing in a book to have a pig go down the street pulling a wagon. But if you just put it in there without having a character say, wait, that's impossible. Why would a pig be drawing a wagon down the street? You won't your reader will not be along with you as author and saying, oh my goodness, this is irregular, but it must be real because it's acknowledged, or it must be real because we have this physical testimony. So on Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, I recommend that people go back and actually read the novella. Don't trust the movies, and find how the story is gradually revealed, and imagine being part of those early readers who wouldn't have known the solution and could have been aghast and surprised and alarmed, which is something, alas, of which we are robbed now.
Now, on the last occasion we spoke, you talked about the way in which horror fiction plays with the imagination of the reader, and we start to identify with the different protagonists within the novel. And probably the Jekyll and Hyde has become almost part of our modern way of describing people or things, situations. Do you think it's the most stark example of that, where there's the two embodying the one?
It's the one that I think is most famous today, but that also is a recurring theme, and you can see doubling and the doppelganger and encountering yourself in a way that it's unnerving because it's unnatural, and yet it can happen. So you see that but you see that influence in many literary genres, and something we haven't mentioned, but I think we ought to, is that the Gothic, as it emerged, was influencing novelists you might not consider Gothic, but who had Gothic elements in their works and also had mystery elements in their work. If you read Jane Eyre, it has Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, so many of the marks of a Gothic novel. Wuthering Heights, Gothic novel. So many of the writings of Charles Dickens, Gothic. So all part of this genre, and many of them would have elements such as doubling, or the startling encounter of something like you that is not you. It's unnerving. It's unnerving, and it's meant to be. No, I'd say overall, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is the most famous example in that century that pops to mind.
Absolutely. Now, moving across the Irish Sea from Edinburgh to Dublin, we come to Sheridan Le Fanu, who definitely fits the stereotype of a horror writer. I believe he wrote at night with a candle. He was only seen at night, some people say. But he revolutionized the whole idea of a ghost story.
He did, and he brought so much of the Irish tradition in, and there's a real delight, but also a humor. I think that Ireland contributes to the genre. My last novel was actually set in Ireland, because I wanted to play with the monsters of folklore and myth, and it was not only a tremendous breeding ground for horrors. It had that element of humor. It was very easy to have it be terrifying and funny at the same time. So I think Le Fanu, it's not that you'd pick him up and you would laugh yourself to stitches, but you would have a sense of being told a darn good yarn at the same time. So he's a wonderful, wonderful novelist.
Yes, I think the word maybe we're groping towards is devilment.
Yes.
Eleanor, which has a double meaning, but absolutely. But he, in turn, then influenced another Dubliner who becomes somebody or writes a novel as famous as Frankenstein at the start of the century. His novel came out in 1897 and was, of course, Dracula. What do you make of it as a novel, first of all?
I think I said last time, it's a magnificent train wreck. It's full of plot holes. Sometimes the characters come off as wooden, but it's one of the most brilliant, terrifying, delightful works. I'll share something personal. The first time I read it, I can remember lying on my bed, reading through and laughing to myself after reading one of the most bloody scenes, thinking how ridiculous it all was, how absurd. And then I looked down and the sunlight was coming. It was the middle of the day. The sunlight was streaming in through my window and reflecting off the book, which was blood red in color, and it looked like there was blood on my hands. I was so terrified. I dropped the book that I'd been laughing at, and I couldn't read it for several days because I was so terrified. So that Stoker is able both to be at times outrageous and ridiculous, and yet be so terrifying. It's deserving of its fame.
You touched upon the earlier vampire novel written by Polidori, which was based on his employer, who was Lord Byron. There are many theories about Dracula, how it was written, who really it was about, the elements that were in it. What we do know about Stoker is that certainly in his short stories, he included a lot of his own autobiographical material. Do you think that this was a sort of a cipher for a lot of what was going on in Stoker's own life? I'm thinking in particular his relationship with his employer.
Yes, I think I find the Henry Irving, the great Shakespearean actor, for whom Bram Stoker worked. Bram Stoker was a theater manager for the Lyceum, that he was influenced by the personality of his employer. He was influenced by his roles, particularly his great tragic or villainous roles. And I think a lot of it was just admiration and his desire. He wanted so much for Henry Irving to play Dracula on stage. Of course, when Henry Irving witnessed a reading of Dracula, he dismissed it as rubbish, which was very devastating. So I could see that influence very much. Another thing I see on his personal life is that role as the manager of a theater. There are so many moments in that novel that feel like the cast of thousands is coming forward onto the stage nobly to perform and then to bow. I mean, it has a very theatrical sweep to it, even in the arrangement of the characters. And I think that's one of the reasons it's so delightful. But Irving's dismissal, you can understand because he took himself very seriously. On the other hand, I feel it was a very much a missed opportunity that he could have done a better job of Dracula than the Count actually does himself. The Count is most terrifying when you don't see him. When he actually shows up in the novel, it feels a little bit like he's twirling a handlebar mustache. A little bit corny in parts, but he's terrifying as an idea and terrifying as an influence, even though he doesn't have any good monologues.
Do you think perhaps in Irving's case, I mean, he dismissed it, you're absolutely right, as trash of one sort or another, but do you think maybe also it was a little too close to the bone?
That's also very possible.
Right. So the other thing about it's interesting your thesis there about the different characters coming on and the actor manager, the theater manager coming to the fore, because people have put together a number of suggestions as to who these characters really were. I mean, for example, a lot of people are aware that Bram Stoker's brother was a very eminent physician in Ireland, and was in charge of the largest psychiatric institution in Ireland. And obviously psychiatric institutions and what have you plays a role in that. But also strange things like the whole American side of Dracula, and suddenly these kind of, for want of a better expression, cowboys and Indians being introduced into this Gothic realm, when in fact what we know is Bram Stoker and Irving as well were great friends of Buffalo Bill and the whole sort of Wild West circuses that were very popular in Europe. Do you see anything that, I think it was it Hemingway or said that all fiction is ultimately autobiography? Do you think there's something in Stoker's own psyche that was coming through in Dracula? And if so, what exactly was it?
Well, I think what you've described very much would be rooted in Bram Stoker himself, and that as I said with earlier on, either in reference to Stoker or to Le Fanu, I can't remember, but the notion that the Irish influence is telling a darn good yarn. Well, and that devilment you mentioned, a little bit is Bram Stoker saying, "Oh, this would be exciting, and I just experienced it over here," and bring in Buffalo Bill. And if what would be wonderful, well, let's bring in the psychiatric side, which is actually one of my favorite parts of the novel. The entire Dr. Seward's hospital and the lunatic Renfield is just so brilliantly crafted. But you do get a feeling as if Bram Stoker has a whole feast set before him, and he wants to try a little bit of everything. So everything that he's seen and witnessed that he feels would be a delightful addition, he throws into the pot. And the result is a very messy combination, but quite brilliant. I think of the character of Dr. Van Helsing himself was actually meant to be three different characters in the original design of the novel. It was going to be a doctor, a research student into preternatural and psychiatric elements, and then there was a detective. But he decided to combine them all into this Dutch polymath who one moment is spouting, well, what he calls metaphysics, even though it's not really metaphysics, and the next he performs an operation on the floor and says, "Well, I can totally perform surgery." So he does all of these things, and he says, "Actually, I'm a master of law too." So in the same way that Van Helsing is a hodgepodge, you get this idea that Bram Stoker just wanted to throw every single thing into his Dracula pot, and to good effect. Well, the thing he wrote.
This must be a weakness for all horror authors, surely, Eleanor, to throw everything at the wall and see what sticks, no?
Yes, and that's when our editors step in and say, "That's all very well." Speaking from personal experience, you may only have this many Irish monsters. You cannot have 30 of them. It's too confusing.
Absolutely. Now, you probably know that Dracula wasn't the best-selling horror novel of its day, that there was another novel called The Beetle. Are you familiar with this?
That is one of the funniest novels. Yes, I have read it.
Just tell the audience a little bit about that, because a lot of people will know Dracula and Bram Stoker, but The Beetle has, I'm afraid, disappeared into obscurity, but was more popular than Dracula in its day.
It was, and it was, if I can remember the elements of plot, it's essentially a scarab, a giant beetle that assaults London. So it's the same dynamic, but instead of a vampire, it's a bug. And it's not remotely as well written. It's unintentionally hilarious throughout. It's really, I can remember various assaults on female characters. It's been over 20 years since I read it, and at the time I laughed heartily through the entire thing. But I could see how a reader would find it horrid and terrifying. A lot of it too, I think, depends on how familiar you are with the genre. If you understand the genre and you know the genre and you can see all of the tropes emerging, it can become less terrifying because the mechanics either become fascinating or hilarious.
Absolutely. And I think as well there's another theme, which is because I think the bug or whatever it is comes from Egypt, as Dracula came from this sort of exotic realm of Transylvania. There's this idea of sort of the exotic invading modernity of some sort. Is this a common theme in 19th century horror fiction?
Absolutely. Absolutely, because of course, post-Enlightenment man has rejected monsters. So when monsters come from foreign parts, which they must, imported either by Catholics or Jews or an Egyptian, or so all these dangerous foreigners who are not English, they bring these things in. Well, we don't have the weaponry to fight anymore. I always ask my students, if you were Dracula, would you rather face a mob in Romania, or would you rather attack Jonathan Harker? And they all say Jonathan Harker because Jonathan Harker doesn't believe that vampires exist. So how much easier to destroy him. He'll just have a little bit of a meltdown over on the side there and write copious notes, whereas the peasant mob either might know the folklore for dispatching a vampire or would just go get the local exorcist to handle it. So yes, very much the threat of these ancient creatures, or ancient and foreign creatures, attacking England and then saying, well, wait, how do we fight them? How do we battle these creatures and things that do not belong here in modernity? It's a wonderful, wonderful element of Gothic tension. You do see a major shift, and that probably is very much owing to the trauma, the worldwide trauma of the war of World War I and World War II, and shift into different sorts of genres, different sorts of interests. And the Gothic novel itself, it split, and you had horror genre that would be more familiar to what we know today, horror genre as it emerges in the films. You have sci-fi explode. So fantasy itself starts going into various realms, and the horror genre at this moment is quite different from the Gothic tradition, but not wholesale. There are still some novelists who dabble more in a Gothic vein than in straight horror, that is contemporary horror, which has less of a thread of hope and redemption, I should say. Because in Gothic fiction, there's always the possibility of redemption. Doesn't mean you attain it, and often you don't, but it's still a possibility. And there seems to be more of a thread in horror today of, can you even stay alive against this threat? Setting aside questions about the eternal soul, which would still concern someone like Bram Stoker. But can you even stay alive? And the answer is often no. I think about the zombie craze in recent decades, which is a very there's an element of hopelessness in the genre itself, and desperation, sheer animal human desperation.
That's a very interesting point. Would you go so far as to say, Eleanor, that the 19th century novels were very moral, the horror novels, whereas when we come to the 20th century, a kind of an agreed morality has disappeared?
Yes, I'd say very much that's the case in most novels. Novelists such as Tim Powers, who still is writing deeply moral, and but still writes more, not just in terms of his prose, but in terms of the way he writes his stories, much more in the mode established in the 19th century, although he's a very modern writer, than he does in contemporary horror. So he's a supernatural or preternaturally infused writer, rather than just gazing into the face of sheer horror without a moral compass or supernatural net to keep one from absolute destruction.
That's very interesting. Do you think then that the horror novel has kind of escaped its bounds? That it's no longer about sensationalism or sort of staged dramatics, but it is something which is touching what all of us encounter at some point in our lives, which is some kind of fear about something, or irrational fears, or that sort of thing. Do you think that that's where the 20th century novels sort of escaped into that hinterland?
Largely, and I think that in a way it makes them more monstrous, and for me, less human, and thus less interesting, for me personally, because it's the sheer, it's almost like going into the emotion of horror to the point that the emotion is completely overwhelming and there's no rational point anymore. It's just sheer unadulterated horror, which is why I think calling it horror now makes so much more sense than seeing it as Gothic. So they are very different. They're very different because the Gothic still maintains hold on uh, that hope for redemption, the moral thread, um, but also a thread of rationality.
Now, at the start of this decade, the horror genre, ghost stories in general, the sales of these novels exploded. I mean, the figures I quoted in my opening monologue, I think it's 54% in the space of a couple of years. It doesn't take long to think, though, where maybe a lot of the horrors or the elements of real life horror lay when we lived through the pandemic and everything around that. We were sort of living in our own horror novel at that point. Do you think that that has influenced modern horror writing?
I think, yes, very much so. And I wonder too if it's not a wonderful opportunity for horror to regain some of its uh, moral and philosophical muscles. So instead of drawing people in merely for the emotion which they've already experienced in some way, in the same way that they would have experienced it in the Great War, so that societal trauma, and then saying, all right, here we are with the emotion. What sort of questions can we address here? It could be the reemergence, and the expansion of the genre. So it's an interesting moment for it to explode, but it also does make sense.
Now, your novels are often set in the 19th century, early 20th century. Um, they are gothic in the sense that they have vampires and werewolves and such like. How do you avoid, first of all, the obvious cliches around those entities, but also what elements of the 21st century consciousness that we've just been talking about do you think informs your work?
Partly a knowledge of the genre overall. So one of the things that has attracted me to it, as I've mentioned, is that mixture of depth, moral and philosophical depth, but also unintentional hilarity. So saying, how can you have a coherent anthropology of monsters, a preternatural catalog? Well, I created a world where a very matter-of-fact exorcist operates. But of course, the matter of fact exorcist can't be one's narrator because he would just be matter of fact, and that would not be effective in a Gothic novel. So, finding narrators who are hysterical, easily frightened, or fascinated, or whatever can draw the reader into the experience of things invisible. And or some things that are visible and really oughtn't to be, the unnatural, the undead. How do you negotiate this as a reader so that you have a sense that there's a coherence behind it, a rational understanding of how the world works with these monsters in it? And yet that's not the narrative because it's not a scientific text, it's a novel. So have the encounters, the human encounters of the characters with this be the be what draws it in and what makes them entertaining to write, certainly. Also, it's tremendous fun to take a narrator and then freak him out a bit.
Now, the latter part of the 20th century, horror fiction is synonymous with Stephen King, who is not only a phenomenal writer of horror fiction, but a very popular writer. I mean, have all subsequent horror authors been influenced, you think, by Stephen King?
I think I could see a large influence there, but I also mentioned Tim Powers here, and there's also that sort of side as well. And I think that there again, there's still this spectrum where the popularity of the genre, which always a popular genre has always been suspect. I mean, Dickens was considered not worthy of scholarly consideration for a long time until G.K. Chesterton championed him. But so the popularity itself and the accessibility of the genre. But there's also, and I think Stephen King is aware of it, I know Tim Powers certainly is, knowledge of the past, of what's come before, of what the genre represents, not just mere thrills, terrors, horrors, but what can we lean on historically in the literary canon or outside the canon in some cases. So I could see his influence, but I think the best of the novelists today also would have a consciousness that goes further back and takes it all in stride together to the table when you sit down to write.
Now, many people would be familiar with the work of Stephen King and indeed the kind of phenomena that he has become. Less so the other author you mentioned, Tim Powers. How would you differentiate the two? Are they different ends of the same spectrum?
I think so. And I think Tim Powers too, his literary knowledge and his imagination just combined it's just remarkable. I think of one of his most famous works, The Anubis Gates, which is set in the early days of the Romantic poets, but it involves time travel and a werewolf and the attempt to inhabit bodies to succeed people's souls and bodies to maintain life forever. And there's also an Egyptian element in it. And there's a demonic clown living under the underground in London. It's just this a little bit like Bram Stoker, this mixture of all the different things you can throw into the pot. And yet one of the enduring themes is the transformation of the hero. A Tim Powers hero, true Gothic hero, is always, if not beaten nearly to death, ritually dismembered in some way. So it's the idea that one must be taken apart and put back together and made new, radically made new. It's just a fascinating moral arc that he's able to bring into his works.
What sort of moral arc would you say is behind the Stephen King universe, if there is a moral universe there?
I'm sure there is. I'm not sure. And it may also just be similar to what I've described in Powers, but I think you're more well versed with Stephen King than I, and I still think there is a desire for some degree of moral redemption. Otherwise, if there weren't a desire for transformation and redemption, narratives get pretty boring. But in all of these writings, and you can see the same in science fiction, there's just this desire for an explanation beyond the natural world. And I think that takes us all the way back to the Romantics when I said they were reacting, the Romantics and the early Gothics who were reacting to the Enlightenment and saying, yes, I see the natural world, but my experience is so much more than things quantifiable by empirical science. So I want there to be something more and a greater explanation offered from something, angels, demons, the preternatural, the supernatural. So it's a yearning, whether it's for aliens, for some sort of meaning.
Which leads us sort of back to an influence, I think, certainly on Stephen King, and that was H.P. Lovecraft, who had a view of the universe which was all his own, shall we say, but was very dark as well. Do you think Lovecraft, his writing, well, his universe more so than his writing, has influenced, again, the sort of late 20th century view, which is perhaps a little bit more nihilistic than 19th century writers would have suggested?
I think very much so, very much so. And I would say for him, the counterpoint or the antidote would be something like C.S. Lewis's Space Trilogy. Which is another completely different view of how the universe operates, but not nihilistic. So that it's sort of like we can go dark or we can go light. Which approach are we going to take to a Gothic or horror reality? And I do think the Lovecraft is we're bearing towards the darkness. More so than many, but not all, Gothic novels before that.
Which is something you alluded to in one of our earlier discussions, Eleanor, the way that horror fiction reflects interprets even the societal changes around it. It's a very good cipher for sort of feeling the pulse of where we're up to, no?
Yes, and cultural anxiety is when I teach Dracula and I explain to my students the anxiety felt as they approach the end of a century. I was a little dismayed when I tried to explain, well, as we approached Y2K, and then I realized most of my high school students, they weren't around back then. But saying that same sort of widespread anxiety, which now they do know because of experience of the pandemic. So it's what does it feel when society itself is oppressed by a fear, a shared anxiety. Um, so in that respect, horror genre can be it can be a form of not just of escapism, but therapy to figure out what sort of coping mechanisms one can gain in the face of some fear or traumatic experience that is so widespread culturally.
Now I know you're a working mother of a large family. Is your writing in this genre, is that your escapism?
Yes, to some degree, yes. Um, again, I do it very much with a with my tongue in my cheek at some moments. But I do laughingly tell the children sometimes that the reason I write about monsters that attack in the night is because I haven't had a full night of sleep in a very long time.
But I've also heard that horror writers are generally a rather jolly bunch in comparison with maybe some of the modernist writers who were notoriously depressed or depressing. Is that your experience?
I think so. Well, I think it's because if you really want to play in the genre to a degree, the suspension of the author's disbelief requires that you take your craft seriously, but yourself not so seriously. So, when my first Gothic novel came out, A Bloody Habit, and it became known at our local church what I was doing. Um, People were struck, but they would laugh. They'd come up to me laughing and saying, "What did you publish? What did you write? What do you do in your off time?" So there's a sense of quirkiness and eccentricity, which I know I have friends who are novelists, Karen Yulo, who is another novelist who's dabbled in the Gothic, and we talk about the outrageousness of the genre, and it being able to write in it and enjoy it without taking yourself too seriously is itself a form of therapy, I'm sure.
Now, other than your own novels, Eleanor, if there's somebody watching this who's never dipped their toe into these horror waters, where would you sort of direct them to begin with?
Well, I would probably, depending on what they've read before, of course, start with Frankenstein and Dracula. And then if I wanted to go modern, I would recommend Tim Powers, whom it just monumental writer, fantastic writer. Um, and then I would just go through the many of the authors we've mentioned. I would recommend Poe, but I would also recommend reading Poe's detective fiction. And then I would recommend reading Dickens, but I would read Bleak House, which is Gothic and a detective novel, and neither. Um, so I would read Le Fanu, see and just see what appeals to the reader, and also have them read Northanger Abbey. I always have to laugh. I know we discussed it in a previous episode. Um, the first time I read Northanger Abbey, I was about 12 or 13 years old, and I hadn't read much Gothic fiction. I'd read ghost stories, but the result was I hadn't read Anne Radcliffe. I felt as if somebody really smart was being hilarious, and I was outside the joke because I couldn't understand what she was joking about. So I felt very left out. After you've read some Gothic novels, go back and read Jane Austen and laugh with her, and do not have the experience I had when I was younger, because then it'll be more delightful and you won't feel a little bit left behind.
Would you almost go to say that Jane Austen is as much of an influence as, say, Mary Shelley on your writing?
I would say Jane Austen and Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens, very few writers capture the redemptive power of violence like Charles Dickens does. Incredible influence on me as a young writer. Um, yes, very, very much so. And the Victorians, the Brontes, Gaskell to an extent, Anthony Trollope, P.G. Wodehouse, also much further on. But and the detective genre, starting with Edgar Allan Poe and Wilkie Collins, and then going all the way up into the great 20th century detective novelists.
For now, Eleanor, I'm afraid we've come to the end of our wanderings through the horror genre. For now, tell people where they can find out more about you and your novels.
The best place is my personal website. It's eleanorbourgnicholson.com. And please reach out to me because I love to hear from readers.
Eleanor, thank you very much for coming on Things Visible and Invisible.
Thank you for joining us on another episode of Things Visible and Invisible. We're dedicated to uncovering phenomena that challenge our understanding of reality, from ancient enigmas and paranormal encounters to scientific anomalies and forgotten histories. If you enjoyed this journey into the mysterious and unexplained, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting the notification bell to stay updated on future explorations. Have a personal experience or story that aligns with our investigations? We'd love to hear from you. Visit our website at tvi.show and reach out through our contact form. While we can't feature every submission, we review them all, and your story might be featured in an upcoming episode. To support our continued investigations, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter or channel member. Your contributions make these explorations possible and give you access to exclusive content, early releases, and monthly behind-the-scenes discussions with our team. Don't forget to check out our merch store. We've got everything from TVI-branded t-shirts and hoodies to stickers and coffee mugs, perfect for showing your support while keeping the mysteries close. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time as we continue to explore the things visible and invisible.